Hi folks, welcome back to class. Dr. McPhee here, and this is Ethics 400. Today we're going to be discussing a couple of very important topics, especially the topic of cultural ethical relativism. Overall, in this class today, what we're going to be looking at are definitions of culture. We're going to define sociological relativism, cultural ethical relativism. We're going to investigate the idea of tolerance, and then we will take a look at ethical subjectivism. Now, I want you to note that at the end of all of this, the author of our textbook, Judith Voss, rejects cultural ethical relativism and ethical subjectivism as a way forward in terms of an ethical theory. So keep that in mind as we progress throughout this class today. Okay, let's get in place a basic working definition of culture, because culture and the idea of culture will undergird a lot of this lesson today. According to Merriam-Webster, culture is the customary beliefs, social forms, and material traits of a racial, religious, or social group. Now, there are some problems with that definition, but it's a good starting point for thinking about a basic idea of culture. We can also go on and nuance this idea by looking at definition 1b there, which states that it's the set of shared values, attitudes, goals, and practices that characterizes an institution or organization. I think that's a good starting point for thinking about culture. Definition in mind, let's turn to defining the next idea, which is sociological relativism. With that definition of culture in place, we can now begin to engage an idea called sociological relativism. Sociological relativism is not an ethical theory. Sociological relativism is simply the process of an individual or a group going out into the world and observing, describing, and possibly cataloging diverse cultural practices that one encounters in the world. Imagine that our entire class took a field trip around the world and we encountered a diversity of beliefs and ideas and cultural practices with regard to kinship and family, or language, or food and drink, or manners and customs. We could, at that point, simply take stock of what is going on around us. And we could describe that the best way that we could. Sociological relativism emerged in the mid-1800s and later into the 1900s. It emerged under the auspices of anthropologists, sociologists, and others who were attempting to make sense of and to describe and catalog the variety of cultural practices that they encountered in the world. So again, sociological relativism is not an ethical theory. It's more of an anthropological or sociological theory that attempts to engage the world. I was once in a foreign country where my host took me to a restaurant, and on the menu were fried cockroaches. Now, this was certainly different from anything that I had grown up with in the Midwest. However, sociological relativism states that when you encounter something diverse or different like this, you simply note that it is different. You do not attempt to evaluate or to catalog it in a way with normative language. You simply use descriptive language to note the differences. This brings us to perhaps the most important idea in the entire lecture today, and that is the ethical theory of cultural ethical relativism. Cultural ethical relativism is an ethical theory that states that what we ought to do is what the culture dictates. Or in other words, cultural ethical relativism uses culture to evaluate what is ethical or unethical. Cultural ethical relativism rests on two main ideas or premises. The first one is what we'll call the diversity premise. And that idea is simply that when we go out into the world, we do encounter diverse ethical practices from culture to culture. The second main premise is the dependency premise. And that is the idea that ethics depends on the culture in which you find them. So the grand summary of cultural ethical relativism is that we ought to use the cultural standards where we find ourselves to evaluate what is right or wrong, what is good or bad, what is true or untrue about the world in which we find ourselves. Cultural ethical relativism seems simple enough. When we're in another culture, we should adhere to that culture and we should use that culture to evaluate our system of right and wrong. But cultural ethical relativism isn't really that simple in most cases. I've laid out here on this slide several premises that I've seen articulated by cultural ethical relativists. Here are a few of the most important, I think. Premise 3 and 4 and 5 articulate ideas about cultural ethical relativism that simply state that cultures are pure, unique, and separate, and they don't mix. I often see that in arguments regarding cultural ethical relativism. Premises 6, 7, and 8 simply state how ethical judgment or how ethical evaluation should work. Now, there are some serious issues with cultural ethical relativism, and we need to turn to those now to think about how we should or should not use cultural ethical relativism as a system of ethics. Our first step in evaluating cultural ethical relativism should be to acknowledge some of its potential powerful insights. Cultural ethical relativism can push us to think about other cultures in a way that entitles all people to their own way of living and being. So cultural ethical relativism can potentially open the doors to freedom and to ideas of various ways of living in the world. Cultural ethical relativism can also press us and question us in terms of how we see the world and the potential ethnocentrism that we might carry into exploring and discovering the world around us. Cultural ethical relativism finally also might push us to understand a culture and its practices in its own context, in its own worldview, in its own web or nexus of practices. And that's helpful in avoiding any comparison of cultural practices. So all of these parts of cultural ethical relativism are tremendously helpful on their own. However, there are serious questions with cultural ethical relativism, and you'll find that most ethicists reject cultural ethical relativism as an ethical system. Why? Well, here are some important questions to ask about cultural ethical relativism. First, what is culture? How do we understand a cultural practice or a cultural standard? If we were to go to a city, even in the United States, let's say we all went to San Francisco on a field trip, how would we know what their cultural practices were? How would we know what their quote unquote society looked like or what their cultural practices actually entailed? Would we have to survey 10 people, 100 people, 1,000 people? And what if those individuals didn't agree on what the practices or cultural habits of San Francisco looked like? So simply identifying what culture looks like or how we define it in a specific context is important. Secondly, sometimes cultural ethical relativism is self-defeating. or paradoxical. We'll cover that more on the next slide. Thirdly, cultural ethical relativism seems to confuse custom or cultural practice with ethical analysis. Here we have an image of a young woman who is texting and driving. And I dare say, I would bet that a lot of us have texted and driven at some point in our life. If someone from outside of our culture came and lived with us for a while and saw people texting and driving, does that mean that that's a cultural practice? Should they then take up texting and driving in our culture? So the idea of the difference between what is a practice and then what is ethical analysis seem to be confused or conflated in cultural ethical relativism. Finally, there's the idea in most ethical systems today that there are moral minimums or some moral floors that we should engage in terms of thinking about conversations pertaining to ethics. We'll cover that more in another lecture, but the bottom line here is, should we have certain moral minimums in place, like human dignity or respect for others? Should we have certain moral minimums in place before we start talking about diverse cultural practices that we encounter? Cultural ethical relativism has many paradoxes, absurdities, and difficulties that we need to face head on. I'll let you read the first two questions here because they're quite serious. I just want to engage question 3 here. How should we understand other cultures that claim universal reasoning as part of their ethical and cultural practice? For example, cultural ethical relativism states that culture is the basis of ethics. In the 1930s and 1940s, Nazi leaders in Germany claimed that their Germanic cultural heritage provided a hierarchy of quote-unquote races that should be applied universally and not just in Germany. That is, they claimed a universal logic where they should then go out into the world and to kill and imprison millions of people around the world because the Germans thought they were quote unquote impure. They were not part of the Germanic race. In fact, this Nazi ideology went on, as you know, to kill and imprison millions of people in France, Italy, Belgium, the Netherlands, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, the Soviet Union, and many other countries. How should we think about a culture that has universal aspirations to it? That's a difficulty and a paradox of cultural ethical relativism. That brings us to the topic of tolerance, and many will confuse the idea of tolerance with cultural ethical relativism. They will assume that cultural ethical relativism includes tolerance at some level, but that's not really the case, as we've already seen. Many cultures are not tolerant of a wide range of activities and people and cultural practices. So what is tolerance? Well, tolerance is usually when someone is permitting someone else to do something. And let's take an example here. Let's say that we have a police officer named Tony, and she rightfully has the normative assumption that people ought to wear clothes when they're in public. Now, let's say that Tony is working at a festival. And let's say that people at this festival do unusual things. Maybe they drink too much, maybe they eat too much, maybe they begin to take off their clothing, go streaking, whatever. Now, let's say that Tony has the normative assumption or the ethical assumption that people ought to wear clothes, and maybe there are even legal and good ethical reasons for people to wear clothes at this festival. But maybe Tony, in this particular case, permits or tolerates streaking or nudity or whatever at this festival because she's doing a quick reality check. And perhaps she's seeing that that activity doesn't do any harm or not major harm. And so for Tony, tolerance is an act of prudence in her job. Tony is permitting certain things to happen. She is tolerant of certain behavior, but notice she has a normative assumption from which she is starting. This is why tolerance isn't the same thing and can't be confused as necessarily a virtue within cultural ethical relativism. This brings us to the last subject here, which is ethical subjectivism. And in our textbook, the author, Dr. Boss, quite rightfully dismisses ethical subjectivism quite quickly. Ethical subjectivism states that each person, each individual person decides what is ethical or unethical. And ethical subjectivism simply states that each person generates their own ethical norms and values. If there are 8 billion people in the world, therefore, then there are 8 billion different ethical frameworks that we must navigate. Boss rejects both cultural ethical relativism and ethical subjectivism as absurd for good reason. With ethical subjectivism, we would need to take seriously the ethical frameworks of murderers, sociopaths, psychopaths, etc. And so she rejects this as a legitimate ethical system and really considers both cultural ethical relativism and ethical subjectivism as conversation stoppers. So what does she want to do instead? Well, Boss has some good ideas here about how we should promote what we're going to call a moral floor. And this is a picture of Dr. Judith Boss here. Dr. Boss, you'll notice throughout her text, she will be assuming that there is a moral floor or a level below which we should not allow an ethical conversation or our ethical deliberations to drop. You'll notice throughout her text that she will assume certain basic moral goods or ethical goods, including not harming humans without good reasons, not disabling humans, promoting human freedom. Some basic ideas here about what is ethical and what is not ethical, while allowing for broad freedom and discovery and for ethical choice in our everyday behaviors and our everyday deliberations. So just to summarize her position and make it clear again, Boss is rejecting cultural ethical relativism and ethical subjectivism as absurd and as self-defeating. She doesn't take it seriously, and we really won't discuss these ethical theories outside of this first learning unit. Okay, that will do it for this lecture. In this class, we have covered ideas of culture. We've given a basic, very simple definition of culture. We've defined sociological relativism, not an ethical theory, just an approach to describing the world around us. We've looked at cultural ethical relativism. We've looked at ideas of tolerance and how tolerance may or may not be part of cultural ethical relativism. And we've looked at ethical subjectivism. As always, if you have questions, feel free to reach out to me. Take care. Bye.